In the frozen fields of 1941, German soldiers watched something impossible crawl toward them through the snow. It was steel and fury, shrugging off direct hits like they were raindrops, crushing barbed wire beneath treads that seemed to eat the earth itself. What kind of machine could ignore their best weapons and keep coming? Before it terrified the Wehrmacht, this machine was a joke. British military committees called it too slow, too heavy, too weird to work. Engineers had borrowed its design from American farm tractors, meant for plowing mud, not fighting wars. But when Hitler's panzers rolled into Russia in the summer of 1941, this rejected tractor tank would become the one thing Germany never prepared for. The machine was the KV-1 heavy tank, and its story begins not with generals or battlefields, but with a California inventor who wanted to help farmers cross soft ground. This is a story about how the most devastating weapon can emerge from the most peaceful purpose, and how underestimating your enemy's creativity can cost you everything. The year was 1904. Benjamin Holt had a problem that was costing him customers and reputation. His Stockton, California company built steam tractors for farming, massive machines that could pull plows through tough soil. But California's Central Valley had a secret weapon against progress: mud. When winter rains turned the fields soft, Holt's wheeled tractors became expensive anchors, sinking axle-deep into ground that wouldn't support their weight. Holt wasn't the first to face this problem, but he was the first to solve it properly. He'd heard about earlier attempts to use tracks instead of wheels, experiments in England and Russia that hadn't quite worked. But Holt had an engineer's mind and a businessman's determination. He took a 40-ton steam tractor, removed the rear wheels, and wrapped a flexible track around the frame. The track was made of wooden slats connected by steel chains, spreading the machine's weight over a much larger surface area. On Thanksgiving Day, 1904, Holt tested his invention in the soft peat soil near Stockton. The tractor crawled forward, its tracks laying themselves down like a moving road and picking themselves up behind. It worked. A company photographer watching the test said the machine moved like a caterpillar. The name stuck. Holt patented the design and began selling Caterpillar tractors across America. Farmers loved them. They could work ground that defeated wheeled machines. They could pull heavier loads. They looked strange, like metal insects, but they worked. The military took notice, but not seriously. When World War I broke out in 1914, armies still moved on horses and wheels. Tractors were for farmers, not soldiers. But one man saw the connection that others missed. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, was watching British soldiers die by the thousands in French mud. Machine guns and barbed wire had turned warfare into suicide. Infantry couldn't advance. Artillery couldn't break the deadlock. Churchill asked a question that seemed insane. What if we built an armored vehicle that could cross trenches and ignore machine gun fire? British engineers started experimenting in 1915. They called the project a water carrier tank to hide its true purpose from spies. The name tank stuck. And when they needed a way to make these tanks move across trenches and mud, they remembered those American farm tractors with the Caterpillar tracks. The first British tanks rolled into battle in 1916, looking like armored boxes on Holt-style tracks. They were slow, unreliable, and terrifying. The Germans had nothing like them. But Britain and France won that war without perfecting the tank. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 left most nations convinced that tanks were interesting but not decisive. Cavalry officers still dominated military thinking. Horses had tradition. Tanks broke down. The world moved on, and the Caterpillar track went back to being farm equipment. Except in one place. The Soviet Union, born from revolution and civil war, looked at their vast country with a military planner's nightmare. Russia had almost no paved roads. When spring came, the thaw turned everything into bottomless mud. They called it Rasputitsa, the season of bad roads. And it had defeated armies for centuries. Napoleon's retreat in 1812 wasn't just about winter. It was about mud that swallowed supply wagons whole. If the Soviets were going to defend their territory, they needed vehicles that could move when nothing else could.
Soviet engineers became obsessed with American tractors. They bought Holt Caterpillars and Fordson tractors by the hundreds. They took them apart, studied every component, and learned how to build tracks that could handle Siberian winters and Ukrainian spring mud. By the late 1920s, Soviet factories were producing their own tracked tractors. And unlike Western nations, the Soviets saw no difference between agricultural and military machinery. A factory that built tractors could build tanks. The same engineers worked on both. In 1931, the Soviet Union launched a massive industrialization program. Stalin wanted to turn a peasant nation into an industrial power within a decade. Tractor factories went up across the country. Young engineers fresh from technical schools designed new tracked vehicles. The line between civilian and military blurred completely. The Kharkov locomotive factory started building tanks. The Chelyabinsk tractor plant became the largest tank producer in the world. American industrial methods merged with Soviet scale. By the mid-1930s, the Soviet Union had more tanks than any other nation. Most were light, based on foreign designs or hasty copies. But Soviet military theorists were thinking ahead. They'd watched the Spanish Civil War, where tanks fought tanks for the first time. They'd studied reports from border clashes with Japan. The conclusion was clear. Light tanks weren't enough. They needed heavy armor that could take punishment and break through fortified positions. Engineer Khotin got the assignment in 1938, build a heavy tank that could survive anything. Khotin's team worked from a simple philosophy: armor first, everything else second. They designed a tank with 75 millimeters of frontal armor, thicker than anything in production anywhere. They gave it a powerful 76 millimeter gun, and they gave it wide tracks descended directly from those Holt farm tractors that could push through mud and snow that would trap wheeled vehicles. The prototype rolled out in 1939. It weighed 43 tons, more than twice as heavy as most tanks of the era. It was slow, barely 25 miles per hour on roads. Its transmission was complex and prone to breaking. Soviet factory workers, many of them newly urbanized peasants, struggled to build it properly. But when it worked, it was nearly invincible. They named it KV-1 for Kliment Voroshilov, the defense commissar who'd championed heavy armor. Production started slowly. The factories were still learning. By June 1941, when Germany invaded, only about 600 KV-1 tanks had reached Red Army units. Most crews had minimal training. Soviet military doctrine was in chaos after Stalin's purges killed most experienced officers. The KV-1 was scattered across the front in small groups, usually attached to infantry divisions that didn't know how to use them properly. On paper, the Soviets had a weapon that could shock the Germans. In reality, it was a well-kept secret even from their own army. Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941. 3 million German soldiers, 3,000 panzers, and 7,000 artillery pieces crashed across the Soviet border. The Germans expected quick victory. Their intelligence estimated the Red Army was poorly trained and equipped with obsolete weapons. German panzer commanders had confidence earned through conquering Poland and France. Their Mark III and Mark IV tanks had proven themselves against everything they'd faced. The invasion plan called for reaching Moscow before winter. The first encounters with KV-1 tanks happened within 72 hours. German tank columns advancing through Lithuania ran into Soviet units making scattered defensive stands. Most Soviet tanks were destroyed quickly. The light T-26 and BT tanks burned easily when hit. But then German gunners started reporting something impossible. They were hitting targets dead on and watching their shells bounce off. Heavy tanks were absorbing multiple hits and keep fighting. Something was wrong. Near the town of Rossiani, a single KV-1 created a tactical nightmare that became legendary. The tank had broken down, blocking a crucial supply road. The crew could have abandoned it, but they chose to fight. For over 24 hours, this one tank held up an entire German Kampfgruppe. German tanks tried to flank it and got destroyed. Anti-tank guns scored direct hits that did nothing. German engineers brought up to mine it, but machine gun fire drove them back. They tried towing it with recovery vehicles under covering fire. Nothing worked. Finally, the Germans brought up their secret weapon, the 88mm anti-aircraft gun. This weapon wasn't designed for tank fighting. It was meant to shoot down bombers. But someone had realized its high-velocity shells could punch through heavy armor. Even then, the 88 needed multiple hits from the side and rear before the KV-1 stopped returning fire. When German soldiers finally approached the destroyed tank, they counted over 70 impact marks on its armor. Most hadn't penetrated. The crew had fought until they ran out of ammunition and options. Similar reports came from across the front. A KV-1 near Dubno engaged German tanks from 800 meters and methodically destroyed them while taking no damage. Another near Lviv held a bridge for 6 hours against repeated attacks. German after-action reports used words like invulnerable and unstoppable. Tank commanders demanded better weapons. Infantry units reported feeling helpless. The psychological impact was devastating. But the strategic picture told a different story. Despite individual KV-1 successes, the German advance continued. The Soviets were losing catastrophic numbers of tanks, men, and territory. The KV-1's armor advantage didn't matter when Soviet units were surrounded and cut off. Poor Soviet logistics meant many KV-1 tanks were abandoned for lack of fuel or spare parts. Inexperienced crews made tactical mistakes. The few hundred KV-1s couldn't stop 3 million invaders. Still, the shock rippled through German command. Intelligence officers scrambled to figure out what they'd missed. How did the Soviets have heavy tanks nobody knew about? Weapons designers started urgent work on better anti-tank guns. Hitler himself demanded reports on Soviet armor capabilities. The assumption of German technological superiority took its first serious hit. By the August 1941, German tank crews had learned to respect Soviet heavy tanks. They developed tactics: avoid frontal engagements, flank when possible, call for 88s immediately. The Luftwaffe started using Stuka dive bombers against Soviet armor. Artillery units practiced direct fire against tanks. The Wehrmacht was adapting, but the adaptation proved the KV-1 had achieved something important. It had created doubt. The documentation of these early encounters comes from multiple sources that cross-verify each other. German military archives contain detailed after-action reports from panzer divisions operating in the Baltic states and Ukraine during June and July 1941. These reports specifically mention encounters with heavy Soviet tanks designated as KV types. Unit commanders filed requests for better anti-tank weapons, citing the failure of standard 50mm guns against Soviet armor. Soviet production records from the Kirov factory in Leningrad and the Chelyabinsk tractor plant show KV-1 manufacturing numbers. Between 1939 and 1941, approximately 639 KV-1 tanks rolled off assembly lines. Quality control reports indicate ongoing problems with transmission reliability and armor plate welding. These weren't perfect machines even when new. The Rossiani incident is documented in the war diary of the German 6th Panzer Division. The entries describe a Soviet heavy tank blocking the Rossiani Scoutville Road on June 24 and 25, 1941. Multiple attempts to destroy or bypass it failed. The diary notes the eventual use of an 88mm flak gun to knock it out. German engineers inspected the destroyed tank afterward and filed technical reports measuring armor thickness and cataloging damage. Photographs from the Eastern Front showed destroyed and captured KV-1 tanks. German intelligence units photographed Soviet equipment extensively. These images reveal the track design, armor configuration, and battle damage patterns. You can see the wide tracks that distributed weight, the thick frontal armor, and the impact marks where German shells hit without penetrating. Soviet veteran accounts collected decades later describe fighting in KV-1 tanks during the early war. Crews reported feeling safer than in light tanks, but frustrated by mechanical breakdowns and poor tactical support. Several accounts mention running out of ammunition while surrounded, or abandoning tanks when the transmission failed behind enemy lines. These human testimonies add context to the bare production numbers. German weapons development records show the timeline of response. By late 1941, contracts were issued for upgraded anti-tank guns. The long 75mm gun that eventually armed the Panther tank started development in direct response to encounters with Soviet heavy armor. Hitler's recorded comments from military conferences mentioned his shock at Soviet tank quality and his demands for German superiority to be restored. The farm-tractor connection is documented through patent records and corporate histories. Benjamin Holt's
For German soldiers facing a KV-1 for the first time, the experience rewrote their understanding of what combat meant. Wehrmacht troops had spent 2 years winning. Poland fell in weeks. France collapsed in 6 weeks. The German military machine seemed unstoppable, and soldiers developed the confidence that comes from constant victory. Then they encountered metal monsters their weapons couldn't hurt. Tank crews described the fear of hitting a target perfectly, watching the flash of impact, and then seeing the enemy tank turn toward them, undamaged and angry. You're trained to believe your equipment works. You're trained to trust your skills. When both fail, something breaks in your tactical reasoning. German panzer commanders started avoiding engagements with heavy Soviet tanks, calling for artillery or air support instead. That caution saved lives, but slowed the advance. It also created psychological pressure that built over months of grinding Eastern Front combat. Infantry soldiers had it worse. Your anti-tank rifle was supposed to stop tanks. That's why you carried the heavy weapon and its even heavier ammunition. But when you fire at a KV-1 and your shots bounce off like thrown rocks, you're not just helpless, you're obsolete. German infantry accounts from 1941 describe the sound of their anti-tank rounds hitting Soviet heavy armor and ricocheting away. Then came the sound of the tank's gun traversing toward them. No cover works against a tank gun. For Soviet tank crews, the KV-1 represented something rare in those desperate months: a chance. Most Red Army soldiers fought with whatever equipment survived the initial onslaught. Light tanks burned when hit. Trucks ran out of fuel. Infantry rifles were old. But if you were assigned to a KV-1 crew, you had armor that could protect you. That psychological edge mattered enormously in an army that was losing catastrophically. Veteran accounts describe the feeling of sitting inside 75mm of steel plate while German guns fired at you. You'd hear the impacts, feel the whole tank shudder, and watch for penetration. When the armor held, when the enemy shell failed to punch through, you felt invincible. That feeling didn't last. Reality intruded through mechanical failures, ammunition shortages, and tactical situations where even the best armor couldn't save you. But for brief moments, KV-1 crews experienced what German panzer crews had felt for 2 years: technological superiority. The human cost came when that superiority failed. Tanks burn. Soviet design prioritized armor and guns over crew safety.
If a shell penetrated the armor, the interior became an inferno. Diesel fuel doesn't ignite as easily as gasoline, but it still burns hot enough to kill. Escape hatches were small. 5 men in a confined space have seconds to evacuate. Most didn't make it. German soldiers who inspected destroyed KV-1 tanks found charred remains that told stories of desperation. War reduces humans to statistics, but every statistic was someone's terror in those final seconds. Civilians trapped in the invasion corridor saw tanks as harbingers of destruction, regardless of whose side they fought for. A KV-1 rolling through your village meant combat was near. It meant buildings would burn, civilians would die, and nothing you owned mattered anymore. The tank crews probably didn't even see you. They were focused on survival, on tactical problems, on following orders in chaos. Your home was just terrain to them, a place that either provided cover or didn't, that either blocked their advance or facilitated it. The psychological impact extended beyond individual encounters. Germany had built its military reputation on technological superiority and tactical excellence. Every soldier knew they had the best training and equipment. That confidence was strategic. It made soldiers aggressive, willing to take risks because they believed they had the edge. The KV-1 undermined that belief. If the Soviets had tanks Germany couldn't match, what else had intelligence missed? Doubt is corrosive in military organizations. It makes commanders cautious, soldiers hesitant. For Germany, that doubt arrived too late to change strategy but early enough to matter tactically. For Soviet tankers who survived the war, the KV-1 remained a source of pride mixed with frustration. They'd piloted machines that scared the Wehrmacht. They'd proven Soviet industry could compete with German engineering. But they also remembered the breakdowns, the abandoned tanks, the times when armor wasn't enough. Victory in 1945 came through different tanks, the T-34 and IS series, that learned from the KV-1's successes and failures. But in 1941, when everything seemed lost, the KV-1 gave hope. Sometimes that's worth more than statistics suggest. This story illustrates a fundamental principle in military innovation. Breakthroughs often emerge from solving civilian problems. Benjamin Holt didn't set out to revolutionize warfare. He wanted to sell tractors to farmers who worked soft ground. The Caterpillar track succeeded because it addressed a practical need without military constraints. Sometimes, the best military technology comes from people who weren't trying to build weapons at all. Think of it like water finding the path of least resistance. Military designers in the early 1900s were locked into thinking about improving wheels or inventing entirely new locomotion systems. Holt approached the problem differently because he wasn't a military man. He just needed his machines to not sink. That outside perspective, unburdened by military doctrine or warfare assumptions, produced an elegant solution that transformed everything from agriculture to armored combat. The Soviet success with the KV-1 reveals another pattern. Industrial adaptation matters more than pure invention. The Soviets didn't invent tracked vehicles or heavy armor. They copied, modified, and scaled up existing technology. But they succeeded because they understood their specific operational environment. Russian mud and Soviet industrial capacity shaped the design more than abstract engineering ideals. They built what worked for their situation, not what impressed at military exhibitions. Compare this to German tank development. Germany created sophisticated, well-engineered machines that performed beautifully in ideal conditions. But ideal conditions rarely exist in war. The Tiger tank that eventually countered the KV-1 was mechanically complex, expensive to build, and difficult to maintain. It was a brilliant solution to the problem of, how do we build a tank that wins specifications comparisons? The KV-1 solved a different problem. How do we build a tank that survives Russian conditions long enough to fight? Different questions produce different answers. This connects to broader patterns in technological competition. The side with supposedly superior technology often loses to the side that better matches their technology to their operational environment. American Shermans were technically inferior to German Panthers in gunpowder and armor. But America built 50,000 Shermans because they prioritized manufacturing efficiency and mechanical reliability. Battles aren't fought by individual machines, but by entire industrial systems. The farm-to-battlefield heritage of Soviet tank tracks represented this philosophy. Build something that works, build it in quantity, and adapt it to your terrain. The intelligence failure that let the KV-1 surprise Germany demonstrates how assumptions create blind spots. German military intelligence was sophisticated, professional, and generally accurate, but they approached Soviet analysis with ideological preconceptions. Nazis believed Slavic peoples were racially inferior and therefore technologically backward. That belief made them dismiss evidence that didn't fit their worldview. When reports mentioned Soviet heavy tanks, analysts assumed they were exaggerations or propaganda. This wasn't incompetence. It was the systematic blindness that ideology creates. You see this pattern throughout history. The British assumed American colonists couldn't fight professional soldiers. Napoleon assumed Russia couldn't oppose French military science. Japan assumed Americans were too soft for total war. Every case involved a stronger power dismissing a weaker one based on cultural assumptions rather than evidence. The KV-1 wasn't just a tank. It was a wake-up call that the Soviets were serious industrial competitors who'd learned from American mass production and applied it to military manufacturing. The farm-to-battlefield pipeline also shows how dual-use technology shapes military power. Nations that maintain strong civilian industrial bases can convert that capability to military production when needed. The tractor factories that built KV-1 tanks weren't militarized plants disguised as civilian facilities. They were actual civilian plants that could shift to military production because the underlying technology overlapped. This is why peacetime industrial capacity matters strategically. It represents latent military potential that only becomes visible when war begins. From an engineering perspective, the KV-1 exemplifies design philosophy differences between approaches. German engineering culture valued precision, efficiency, and theoretical optimization. Soviet engineering culture valued robustness, simplicity, and practical function. Neither was objectively better, but they suited different circumstances. On muddy roads with poor maintenance facilities and hastily trained crews, Soviet design philosophy produced better results. In ideal conditions with proper maintenance and professional crews, German philosophy shined. Wars are rarely fought in ideal conditions. The obsolescence cycle that eventually overcame the KV-1 reveals how military technology advantages are temporary. Every innovation triggers counter-innovation. The KV-1 shocked Germany into developing better anti-tank weapons and heavier tanks. Once those appeared, the KV-1's advantage evaporated. By 1943, it was outdated. That's how arms races work. Today's unstoppable weapon is tomorrow's museum piece. The only constant is that both sides keep adapting. This history also demonstrates